All right, so are you ready to dive into this whole Korean conflict thing with me? I'm kind of fascinated by it.
Absolutely. It's one of those historical events that people think they understand, like just a Cold War standoff. But there's so much more to it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I always thought of it as, done and dusted history.
Right, most people do. But see, that's the thing. It never actually ended.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the Korean conflict, it's technically still going on.
I had no idea. So, like, what? It's just a ceasefire.
It was an armistice, not a peace treaty. A big difference. Think of it like hitting pause on a movie, not stop.
Wow, okay,
Oh,
whoa, that changes things a bit.
right. And that's why it's so interesting to dig into because this isn't just about the past, it's about right now, too. Millions of people living in the shadow of this war that never officially ended.
Okay, yeah, you've got my attention now.
Mm.
So, where do we even begin with this? I mean, the Wikipedia article you sent is pretty dense.
Oh, to really get it, we got to rewind a bit. You see, Korea as one unified country, that's a pretty recent idea.
Like, it wasn't always North and South Korea at each other's throats.
No, not even close. I mean, for centuries, it was mostly different kingdoms and cultures on that peninsula. Never really a global player like, say, China or Japan.
Huh. So no ancient rivalry then?
Nah, the division we see now, that's all 20th century stuff, really starting with Japan taking over Korea back in 1910.
Oh, right, right. They ruled it for a while, didn't they?
35 years, man, that's a generation. And they were harsh, suppressing Korean culture, the whole bit. Imagine what that does to a nation's sense of who they are.
Yeah, not good, I'd imagine. Like trying to build something new and the foundation's all messed up.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, you had all these independence movements popping up, some inside Korea, some with exiles abroad, each with their own idea of what a free Korea should look like.
So even before they were free, they were already divided on what free meant.
Exactly. You had figures like Syngman Rhee, later became the first president of South Korea. He was working with the U.S. And then there was Kim Il-sung up in Manchuria fighting the Japanese. He'd later lead the North. Different visions, different allies. It was a recipe for disaster.
Man, it's almost sad, you know, fighting for a future they hadn't even had a chance to really imagine together yet.
It is sad. And then World War II just throws gasoline on that fire. 1945, Japan loses, and Korea, still trying to find its footing, gets caught in the middle of this new conflict, the Cold War.
Oh, right, because with the Soviets and the U.S.
Yep. They basically carved up Korea between them. Soviets in the north, US in the south. The 38th parallel becomes this dividing line. Imagine that. You finally get rid of one occupier just to be divided up by new ones.
Hold on, so
Yeah.
they sliced Korea in half, like a cake.
It was meant to be temporary, a way to manage the Japanese surrender. Joint administration, eventual reunification. At least that was the idea.
Ah, I see. Good intentions, maybe, but probably not the best thought-out plan.
You could say that. Because, of course, the Cold War didn't exactly encourage cooperation and unity. Quite the opposite. The U.S. and the Soviet Union went from allies to rivals practically overnight.
Right, right.
And Korea. It became the new battleground for their ideologies. The U.S. backed Syngman Rhee in the south. The capitalist and the Soviets backed Kim Il-sung in the north, the communist. That arbitrary line in the sand, it became the new Iron Curtain.
Wow. So you've got two Koreas now,
Mhm.
each wanting to be the real Korea. Recipe for Disaster, Part 2.
And sadly, yeah, that's exactly what happened. All that tension, that fight for legitimacy, it explodes into the Korean War.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
that's what we're going to get into, because that's a whole other... I feel like most people don't even know much about the actual war itself.
Yeah, you're right. It's often called the Forgotten War.
It is. And I got to admit, my knowledge is pretty limited. I mean, I know the basics. North Korea invades, the U.S. gets involved, lots of fighting, and it ends in a stalemate, right?
Oh, it's a bit more complicated than that.
Oh, okay. So what actually went down? Fill me in.
Well, it all kicked off on June 25th, 1950. Imagine this. North Korean troops, backed by Soviet tanks and artillery, just pouring across the 38th parallel. Total shock.
So the South Koreans, they weren't ready for that.
Not at all. The North Koreans were very effective early on, pushing deep into the south. It wasn't the quick win the West had banked on. And you got to remember, this was a scary time for everyone. The Cold War was heating up, people terrified of nuclear war.
Yeah, I can only imagine. The whole world must have been on edge.
Absolutely. And the Korean War just threw more fuel on the fire. It quickly escalated, becoming this brutal fight, drawing in countries from all over. You had UN forces, mostly Americans, trying to push the North Koreans back.
Right, right. Trying to hold the line.
Exactly. But just when it seemed like things might turn around, China steps in on the north side. Changes the whole game.
Wow. So now you've got this massive conflict, millions of soldiers all fighting over this little peninsula. It's crazy.
It was brutal. And the thing is, it wasn't just soldiers fighting soldiers. The civilian cost was enormous.
Yeah, the Wikipedia article mentioned that, the destruction. But do we have any idea how many people died? Civilians, I mean.
It's hard to say for sure, but millions, definitely. Millions more displaced, their homes destroyed, families torn apart. The scars of that war run deep even now.
3 years of fighting, millions dead. It's hard to imagine how it even ends.
Exhaustion, basically.
Yeah.
By 1953, neither side could really win. They were just stuck.
Right. Stalemate.
So on July 27th, 1953, they signed the Korean Armistice Agreement. And that's where things get really interesting.
Because it's not a peace treaty, right? We talked about that
Yeah.
earlier. It's just agreeing to stop shooting at each other.
Exactly. But all the issues that started the war, the anger, the mistrust, that's all still there, just frozen in time.
So you have Korea, this nation with a shared language, a shared history, ripped in half.
And right down the middle, they create the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Heavily guarded, families split apart, unable to see each other. It was devastating.
The war might be over, but it seems like the real problems were just beginning.
Oh, absolutely. And the Cold War. It just made everything worse.
Right, because even though the fighting stopped, the tensions were still there.
Totally. And that's what the Wikipedia article calls the Cold War's shadow, which is a pretty accurate description of what Korea went through.
Yeah.
The U.S. kept a huge military presence in South Korea. Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung, he's tightening his grip on the North, becoming more and more isolated from the world, more authoritarian.
And it wasn't just, tense standoffs, right?
Yeah.
There were those incidents along the DMZ.
Yeah, you had the USS Pueblo, an American ship captured by the North Koreans.
The axe murders.
The Rangoon bombing, even a South Korean airliner shot down.
Right. Crazy stuff.
And it wasn't random. Kim Il-sung, he used these incidents to his advantage.
What do you mean?
He used them to create this image of a hostile South Korea, of the U.S. always meddling, trying to destroy the North. It was all about control, about making his people afraid, dependent on him for their safety.
So cynical, but it worked.
Yeah. Oh, it worked incredibly well. He managed to hold on to power for decades, shaping North Korea in his image.
It's chilling. Did the North Koreans ever actually want reunification during this time, or was that all just talk?
It's tricky. Publicly, sure, they talked about reunification, but on their terms, of course. A unified Korea, but under communist rule. And they were willing to play the long game, even when the world started to change around them.
You mean like when the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union collapsed?
Exactly. You'd think that would have changed everything for Korea, right?
Yeah, Cold War was ending. It seemed like a chance for everyone to, get along.
Right. And for a little bit, there was hope. 1991, both Koreas joined the UN. It felt like a step towards reconciliation. But then...
Then what?
Well, the Soviet Union collapsing, that really hurt North Korea. Their economy tanked. They were isolated, alone. Suddenly, the future looked very uncertain.
And that's when they went all in on nuclear weapons, right?
Yep. They needed something to give them leverage, to guarantee their survival. And what better way than with the ultimate weapon? It was a gamble, a huge risk, but it changed everything. Now, this small, isolated country had the power to threaten the entire world.
Wow. What was the reaction like internationally?
Let's just say nobody was thrilled. Everyone is scrambling. The agreed framework was put together in 1994 to try to stop North Korea's nuclear program.
Did it work?
Not really, no. Like a lot of agreements with North Korea, it eventually fell apart. Sanctions were imposed, talks were held, but no one could find a solution that lasted.
It's like they were stuck on repeat.
Exactly. And meanwhile, South Korea is doing its own thing.
Oh, right. They had been living with the threat of war for decades by this point. What were they doing while all this was going on?
It's really interesting, actually. In 1998, they elect this new president, Kim Dae-jung, and he comes up with this totally different approach. The Sunshine Policy.
Sunshine Policy, what's that?
It was this idea that instead of meeting force with force, they would try to build bridges with the North. Economic cooperation, cultural exchanges, really trying to build trust and understanding. A stark contrast to the North's whole isolationist, militaristic thing.
Wow. So one Korea is building bombs, the other's trying to build peace. It's hard to imagine two more different approaches.
It was a bold move, and for a while it seemed like it might actually work. There were these breakthroughs, moments where it felt like maybe, just maybe, things were changing for the better. But then
9/11 happens.
exactly. The world changed in an instant. Suddenly, the focus shifted to the war on terror. And North Korea, despite their claims that their nuclear program was just about self-defense, they got lumped in with terrorists and rogue states.
Right, with Bush's axis of evil speech. Didn't that pretty much kill any progress that had been made?
Pretty much, yeah. The Sunshine Policy was seen as naive, even dangerous. Tensions flared up again, and all that progress just evaporated.
And back to square one. Distrust, isolation, and a nuclear-armed North Korea. It's a depressing pattern.
It is, and unfortunately, things don't get much better as we head into the 21st century.
Yeah, not exactly a walk in the park, the 21st century. And then, of course, you have Kim Jong-un taking over from his father, Kim Jong-il. A new leader, new anxieties.
Right, because he was a bit of a wild card at first, wasn't he, Kim Jong-un?
That's putting it mildly. In those early years, it felt like he was even more unpredictable, more likely to poke the bear, so to speak. All those missile tests, the threats against the U.S. and its allies, it was nerve-wracking.
Yeah, I remember those headlines. It felt like every other week there was a new missile launch. And those military parades they showed on TV, all that aggression on display.
It was a show of force, absolutely. He wanted to make it clear North Korea was a player on the world stage, whether people liked it or not.
And then, well, who could forget the 2018 Winter Olympics in South Korea? I mean, seeing the athletes from the North and South marching together, that unified flag, it was incredible. It caught everyone off guard, that's for sure. Nobody expected that kind of gesture. And then Kim Jong-un sends his sister, Kim Yo-jong, as part of the delegation. It felt like a genuine olive branch.
Right. Suddenly there's handshakes, smiles, talks of denuclearization. It gave everyone hope.
It did. And it wasn't just for show. Remember, they had those inter-Korean summits, Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un meeting face-to-face, even crossing the DMZ together.
Yeah. Like actually stepping onto each other's soil. Unthinkable just a few months earlier.
It was huge. And they were talking about real progress, reconnecting rail lines, working together on economic projects, even a possible peace treaty. It felt like maybe, finally, things were going to change for good.
And then, of course, the Trump-Kim summits. I mean, a sitting U.S. president meeting with a North Korean leader. Historic. Didn't they actually sign some agreements during those meetings?
They did. There were promises made, pledges to work towards denuclearization, a more stable Korean peninsula. It felt like the stars were aligning for a moment.
So, what happened? Why did it all fall apart?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's complex. The short answer is that both sides wanted different things.
In what way?
Well, the U.S., they wanted complete denuclearization, like get rid of everything, no exceptions, and they wanted guarantees. Kim Jong-un, on the other hand,
He wasn't so keen on giving up his nukes.
he saw them as his trump card, his guarantee of survival. He wasn't willing to just give that up no matter how many promises were made.
So a stalemate. Again. Just dressed up in fancier language this time.
Pretty much. The Hanoi summit in 2019, that was supposed to be the big breakthrough, but it just collapsed. Talks broke down, the promises evaporated.
Another missed opportunity. It's like a broken record with this conflict.
It's tragic, really. And since then, well, things haven't exactly improved. Kim Jong-un, he's done things like destroying the Inter-Korean Liaison Office, a real slap in the face to the South.
And more missile tests, right? It's like he's saying, I'm still here, don't forget about me.
Exactly. And then this year, well, this changes the game completely. Kim Jong-un formally declared North Korea a nuclear weapon state. It's even written into their constitution now. And what's even more telling, they removed all mention of reunification from their constitution, too.
Wow. So no more pretending it's a goal. They're a nuclear power, and that's that.
It seems that way. Whether it's bluster or genuine belief, it's a dangerous game he's playing.
So where does that leave us? Back to square one.
In a way, yes. But it's a more dangerous square one. We're back to the standoff, but with even higher stakes. A nuclear-armed North Korea, a heavily armed South Korea, and the U.S. caught in the middle. It's a recipe for, well, let's just say it's not good.
Not good at all. Man, we started this whole deep dive wanting to understand the Korean War.
And it's so much more than just a war, isn't it?
So much more. It's geopolitics, it's ideologies, it's about the human cost of these conflicts, the families torn apart, the hope for peace constantly dashed against the rocks.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something in the past. It shapes the present every single day.
Well said. This has been, honestly, kind of a heavy conversation, but also really eye-opening. Definitely give me a lot to think about.
It's a complex issue, that's for sure, but one worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think we should probably wrap up. But before we do, any final thoughts, anything you want our listeners to, chew on after they finish listening?
I think the big question, one that keeps me up at night, is this. Why now? Why would Kim Jong-un give up on this idea of a unified Korea, something that's been such a driving force for so long? Does he really believe he can survive as a nuclear power, isolated from the world? Or is this just desperation, a last-ditch effort to hold on to power? We don't know the answer, but whatever it is, it has huge implications for everyone involved, not just on the Korean peninsula.
That is a question to ponder. Well, thank you again for taking the time to really unpack all of this. I feel like I've learned a lot.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Korean conflict. It's a complicated story, but one that deserves our attention, especially now. Until next time.